Welcome to Windy Night Stories. Tonight's story is a fun one by Shirley Jackson. It's called What a Thought. Dinner had been good. Margaret sat with her book on her lap and watched her husband digesting, an operation to which he always gave much time and thought. As she watched, he put his cigar down without looking and used his free hand to turn the page of his paper. Margaret found herself thinking with some pride that, unlike many men she had heard about, her husband did not fall asleep after a particularly good dinner. She flipped the pages of her book idly. It was not interesting. She knew that if she asked her husband to take her to a movie, or out for a ride, or to play gin rummy, he would smile at her and agree. He was always willing to do things to please her still after 10 years of marriage. An odd thought crossed her mind. She would pick up the heavy glass ashtray and smash her husband over the head with it. Like to go to a movie? Her husband asked. I don't think so, thanks, Margaret said. Why? You look sort of bored, her husband said. Were you watching me? Margaret asked. I thought you were reading. Just looked at you for a minute. He smiled at her, the smile of a man who is still, after 10 years of marriage, very fond of his wife. The idea of smashing the glass ashtray over her husband's head had never before occurred to Margaret, but now it would not leave her mind.
This is Shirley Jackson. She actually a great story writer. And someone might try to suggest that this was maybe a feminist work by her. And I'm sorry, Shirley Jackson can never be considered a feminist writer. And I'll show you several takes, various stories, and why they don't work. But in this particular one, she's too honest about what goes on in women's heads. Shirley Jackson is an honest writer about the female psyche. And in this particular case, the only reason feminists might take this particular story to heart is maybe in a private Discord where they say, yeah, this guy who's really good to me and taking care of me, I want him dead. But to the public at large, this is not a sympathetic character, this guy's wife. This guy's not a wife beater or a nasty character or shows anything but kindness and compassion to his wife, and yet she wants to kill him. So it doesn't come off as flattering to the female character. This is it's true too. Listen.
You seem very restless tonight, he said. It's the weather, I guess, Margaret said. Heat always bothers me. Sure you wouldn't like to go to a movie? He asked. Or we could go for a ride, cool off. No thanks, she said. I'll go to bed early. Good idea, he said. What would I do without him, she wondered. How would I live? Who would ever marry me? Where would I go? What would I do with all the furniture, crying when I saw his picture, burning his old letters? I could give his suits away, but what would I do with the house? Who would take care of the income tax?
Yes. Yeah, like if I kill this guy, who's going to take care of me and do all the labor? Who's going to marry her? I guess she wants another. If she kills him, she's thinking, well, I've got to get another servant boy. There's so Shirley Jackson is completely honest about what motivates the female mind. I won't spoil the ending of it, even though it's very short. It's only short. You guys can listen to this. And so this is a very anti-feminist story, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, one of the most famous story by Shirley Jackson is The Lottery. And in it, the person who gets caught in the lottery, and there are consequences to that, she's all for the lottery. They do a lottery in their hometown, and whoever picks it out is in trouble. In any event, she's all for it until she's the one who picks it out. And now it's all, she says this is unfair. And so Shirley Jackson's been very honest about the human psyche. It could have been a guy who was part of the story, but the fact that she made a woman behave like this shows you the egalitarianness of Shirley Jackson's mind and her writings. Okay, so she can't be considered feminist in any way. Now, here's a very long one, but I'm only going to play a couple minutes from the story. This is The Haunting of Hill House, and the main character is female. And Shirley Jackson writes them as honestly as you can. And the characters do become sympathetic because they're petty in the way that real life people are. And she also catches the dynamic between men and women. Now, here I'm just going to play a couple minutes of this.
Yourself angry, Eleanor.
Oh, before I start, I just want to lay the groundwork. The young lady who is the center, the protagonist, she's been living this lifestyle where she's basically been just a servant and a nobody. And when she comes to Hill House, she gets all this attention and she craves it. And then the other young lady involved does not like it.
Mo shouted. You think I want to see my name scribbled all over this foul house? You think I like the idea that I'm the centre of attention? I'm not the spoiled baby after all. I don't like being singled out. Asking for help, did you notice? Theodora said lightly. Perhaps the spirit of the poor little companion has found a means of communication at last. Maybe she was only waiting for some drab, timid... Maybe it was only addressed to me because no possible appeal for help could get through that iron selfishness of yours. Maybe I might have had more sympathy and understanding in 1 minute than you... And maybe, of course, you wrote it yourself, Theodora said again. After the manner of men who see women quarrelling, the doctor and Luke had withdrawn, standing tight together in miserable silence.
She's got the male reaction down pat. These guys see their betters arguing, and they keep their mouths shut, and they wish it was over. That's how men react.
Now at last Luke moved and spoke. "That's enough, Eleanor," he said unbelievably. And Eleanor whirled around, stamping. "How dare you," she said, gasping. "How dare you!" And the doctor laughed then, and she stared at him, and then at Luke, who was smiling and watching her. What is wrong with me, she thought. Then, but they think Theodora did it on purpose, made me mad so I wouldn't be frightened. How shameful to be manoeuvred in that way. She covered her face and sat down in her chair. "Nell, dear," Theodora said, "I am sorry." "I must say something," Eleanor told herself. "I must show them that I'm a good sport, after all, a good sport. Let them think that I'm ashamed of myself." "I'm sorry," she said. "I was frightened." "Of course you were," the doctor said. And Eleanor thought, how simple he is, how transparent. He believes every silly thing he has ever heard. He thinks even that Theodora shocked me out of hysteria. She smiled at him and thought, now I am back in the fold. "I really thought you were going to start shrieking," Theodora said, coming to kneel by Eleanor's chair. "I would have in your place, but we can't afford to have you break up, you know." "We can't afford to have anyone but Theodora in the centre of the stage," Eleanor thought. "If Eleanor is going to be the outsider, she is going to be it all alone." She reached out and patted Theodora's head and said, "Thanks. I guess I was kind of shaky for a minute." "I wondered if you two were going to come to blows," Luke said, "until I realized what Theodora was doing." Smiling down into Theodora's bright, happy eyes, Eleanor thought, but that isn't what Theodora was doing at all.
See, do you hear all that, guys? How Shirley Jackson is so honest. She makes her female characters look terrible. These guys are projecting good intentions that aren't there onto the girls, because like men, they're typical female worshippers. And Eleanor here, of course, she has contempt for their being suckers, basically, for their gullibility. Oh my God. Just a couple more minutes. Eleanor gets alone with the young man of the mansion, and she asks him a personal question. And of course, she gets angry because when he opens up, she figures this is really your cue to ask me about myself, not actually tell me about what's in your mind.
Then he looked at her briefly and smiled what she was coming to know as his self-deprecatory smile. Did Theodora, she wondered, and the thought was unwelcome, did Theodora know him as well as this? "I never had a mother," he said, and the shock was enormous. "Is that all he thinks of me? his estimate of what I want to hear of him. Will I enlarge this into a confidence, making me worthy of great confidences? Shall I sigh, murmur, walk away? No one has ever loved me because I belonged, he said. I suppose you can understand that. No, she thought. You're not going to catch me so cheaply. I do not understand words and will not accept them in trade for my feelings. This man is a parrot. I will tell him that I can never understand such a thing, that maudlin self-pity does not move directly at my heart. I will not make a fool of myself by encouraging him to mock me. I understand, yes.
Yeah, you never having a mother. That's just self-pity, buddy.
She said. I thought you might, he said, and she wanted quite honestly to slap his face. I think you must be a very fine person, Nell, he said, and then spoiled it by adding, warm-hearted and honest. Afterwards, when you go home, his voice trailed off, and she thought, either he's beginning to tell me to something extremely important, or he is killing time until this conversation can gracefully be ended. He would not speak in this fashion without a reason. He does not willingly give himself away. Does he think that a human gesture of affection might seduce me into hurling myself madly at him? Is he afraid that I cannot behave like a lady? What does he know about me, about how I think and feel? Does he feel sorry for me?
Yeah, what does this guy think about me, even though I asked him about himself?
Journeys end in lovers' meeting, she said. Yes, he said. I never had a mother, as I told you. Now I find that everyone else has had something that I missed. He smiled at her. I'm entirely selfish, he said ruefully. I'm always hoping that someone will tell me to behave. Someone will make herself responsible for me and make me be grown up. He is altogether selfish, she thought in some surprise. The only man I have ever sat and talked to alone, and I am impatient. He is simply not very interesting. Why don't you grow up?
There you go. This guy is boring as hell, she says, in his mundane problems. Oh, God. So Shirley Jackson is writing honestly about, like, Nell in this story is still someone that you find interesting and you want to do well, because she's flawed in a very human way and in a very female human way that you don't see being written now. And I don't think you're allowed to. And so, like I say, she shows all the pettiness of the average person's brain. So anyway, we'll show one more clip. Now, this last one is when Eleanor comes to Hill House here, Professor Montague is the top dog. He takes care of things. Shirley Jackson writes his character in beaming, how can I say this? He's someone you would really want to know in person. He's actually a great guy. Then his wife shows up, Mrs. Montague, and Shirley Jackson writes it so that this is every argument I've ever seen between a man and a woman. Let's hear it.
Planchette has been very kind tonight, Mrs. Montague said. John, there are definitely foreign elements present in this house. Quite a splendid sitting, really, Arthur said. He waved a sheaf of paper triumphantly. We've gotten a good deal of information for you, Mrs. Montague said. Now, Planchette was quite insistent about a nun. Have you learned anything about a nun, John? In Hill House? Not likely. Planchette felt very strongly about a nun, John. Perhaps something of the sort. A dark, vague figure even has been seen in the neighbourhood, villagers terrified when staggering home late at night. The figure of a nun is fairly common. John, if you please, I assume you're suggesting that I am mistaken, or perhaps it is your intention to point out that Planchette may be mistaken. I assure you, and you must believe Planchette, even if my word is not good enough for you, that a nun was most specifically suggested. I am only trying to say, my dear, that the wraith of a nun is far and away the most common form of appearance. There's never been such a thing connected with Hill House, but in almost every— John, if you please, I assume I may continue, or is Planchette to be dismissed without a hearing? Thank you. Mrs. Montague composed herself. Now then, there is also a name spelt variously as Helen, Helene, or Elena. Who might that be? My dear, many people have lived. Helen brought us a warning against a mysterious monk. Now, when a monk and a nun both turn up in one house, expect the place was built on an older site, Arthur said. Influences prevailing, you know. Older influences hanging around, he explained more fully. It sounds very much like broken vows, does it not? Very much. Had a lot of that back then, you know. Temptation, probably. Well, I hardly think, the doctor began. I dare say she was walled up alive, Mrs. Montague said. The nun, I mean. They always did that, you know. You've no idea the messages I've gotten from nuns walled up alive. There is no case on record of any nun ever being... John, may I point out to you once more that I myself have had messages from nuns walled up alive? Do you think I'm telling you a fib, John? Or do you suppose that a nun would deliberately pretend to have been walled up alive when she was not? Is it possible that I am mistaken once more, John?
Oh, my God. Does Jackson have this back and forth down perfectly? Just a little bit more.
Certainly not, my dear, Dr. Montague sighed wearily. With one candle and a crust of bread, Arthur told Theodora. Horrible thing to do when you think about it. No nun was ever walled up alive, the doctor said sullenly. He raised his voice slightly. It's a legend, a story, a libel circulated. All right, John, we won't quarrel over it. You may believe whatever you choose. Just understand, however, that sometimes purely materialistic views must give way before facts. Now, it is a proven fact that among the visitations troubling this house are a nun and a... What else was there? Luke asked hastily. I'm so interested in hearing what Planchette had to say. Mrs. Montague waggled a finger roguishly. Nothing about you, young man, although one of the ladies present may hear something of interest. Impossible woman, Eleanor thought. Impossible, vulgar, possessive woman. Now Helen, Mrs. Montague went on, wants us to search the cellar for an old well. Don't tell me Helen was buried alive, the doctor said. I hardly think so, John. I'm sure that she would have mentioned it. As a matter of fact, Helen was most unclear about just what we were to find in the well. I doubt, however, that it will be treasure. One so rarely meets with real treasure in a case of this kind. More likely evidence of the missing nun. More likely 80 years of rubbish. John, I cannot understand this scepticism in you, of all people. After all, you did come to this house to collect evidence of supernatural activity, and now, when I bring you a full account of the causes, an indication of where to start looking, you are positively scornful. We have no authority to dig up the cellar. Arthur could... Mrs. Montague began hopefully, but the doctor said with firmness, No. My lease of the house specifically forbids me to tamper with the house itself. There will be no digging of cellars, no tearing out of woodwork, no ripping up of floors. Hill House is a valuable property, and we are students, not vandals. I should think you'd want to know the truth, John. There is nothing I should like to know more. Dr. Montague stamped across the room to the chessboard and took up a knight and regarded it furiously. He looked as though he were doggedly counting to 100.
That's about as much as I'm going to put you through. But I mean, actually, I didn't dislike Mrs. Montague. There's a real honesty about Shirley Jackson's writing. And she's willing to write flawed female characters that you don't necessarily hate. You know, you actually feel for characters more when they're flawed. And in the internal monologue is just so on. Oh my God. And when I hear like that, she's got that argument between men and women down perfectly, and think, okay, why you married? Why do men do this to themselves? Oh God. Anyway, Shirley Jackson can never be considered a feminist writer ever. And you know, I don't know if you're actually interested in listening to her or reading her stories, but she's a rare gold star female writer, as far as I'm concerned. And that's the end of the story. Goodbye, everyone.